Yeah, okay, so Phil Tily, I've spent over 20 years of my life in the kind of benchmarking space of the real estate industry, helping build the IPD brand, now incorporated with MSCI. I recently moved to Altus Group, which I guess consists of three core pillars in the organisation: software, data and advisory. The software side, the brand there, Artus is the one that most people will kind of identify with, where we're kind of that market-leading valuation tool that's moved across now more into the kind of modelling of the investment fund management space. Data, the incorporation of the Voyant brand, where we're kind of trying to solve one of the perennial problems of the industry, which is bringing together different data sets. And on the advisory side, we work maybe on kind of more workflow management around the valuation process. So that's me.
Great, thank you. Josh.
Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Josh Artus. I'm co-founder of CENTRIC Lab. We're a user experience company. What we do is provide insights, data and design guidelines to those who want to improve the user experience. The way that we achieve that is through our own analytical program, which is a software developed by our in-house neuroscience team. We truly see the value going forward in real estate about the outputs it achieves for the users. So how do you best design space for people who are the end people using the space?
Great.
Hi, I'm William Newton from WiredScore. WiredScore is the digital connectivity rating scheme for commercial real estate. We were founded in 2013 under the auspices of Michael Bloomberg, who was increasingly worried that on the one hand businesses really care about the internet, and then on the other hand the fact that most of them have no idea how well connected a building is before they move in. We've since expanded to London, and then this year Paris, Berlin and Dublin.
Allan.
Good morning. Allan Rieck from Copenhagen, good to be here. True Market Value, we are a transaction advisor, able to offer transparency and assurance to corporate sellers of real estate transactions. And we do that, of course, thanks to technology, where we offer different tools. One is called Negotiate Auction, which is combining really the hybrid between the old economy and the new economy, and combining those two benefits into one. And we have another system called the Prop Exchange, where we, again, by technology, able to find the right price of assets and therefore give that certainty to sellers that they sold at the true market value.
Great, Matt.
Morning. My name is Matt Partridge. I'm CEO of a company called Infabode. We're solving a modern problem in that lots of companies out there, or all companies out there, release a lot of information, whether that be research, insights, transactional information, to the industry, but they all do it either by sending it straight to their clients or they put it on their website. So if you wanted to find it, we would go to Google, we would type in what we're interested in, London West End office market, we'd have 6 million results, and we'd have to click into each individual one to find out what the companies are doing within the various sectors. So Infabode works with all these companies, builds a platform where you can sign up and you can access this information, subscribe into the sectors that you care about.
Just starting with you, Phil, for a minute. So technology has been a catalyst for change, disruptor in many areas of life. Do you buy Dan's view that it's an evolution or a revolution? How do you see that?
Well, I put my hand up for evolution. So, and actually, we debated this a little bit at work the other day. So, I mean, I think the capability of all the technologies that are going to come together. I mean, that I'm certain will have a revolutionary impact on the marketplace. And I can quantify that in a second. I think at the moment, the challenges for the property industry are quite simplistic in a way, in terms of just organising data, bringing that information sets together. So that's what I think a lot of the kind of robotic automated processes are directed at the moment, kind of digitalising effectively the past. So I think that's what a lot of the technology is currently focused on. There's obviously the huge opportunity out there now in terms of, Dan's mentioned the words Internet of Things. Within one building, you connect together multiple buildings at city level, and the amount of data that you bring together is quite vast. You apply kind of artificial intelligence and machine learning to that, and then the ability to kind of second guess the future becomes a lot more powerful, and then more liquid. I mean, ultimately, a more liquid asset class is things that will ultimately move towards. And so, revolution for me is something that would ultimately disrupt the risk-return demographic of the marketplace. So something that changes the cash flow element, the frequencies the market's traded, so ultimately changes its risk return, and so having to consider it in a different way in terms of how it fits into an institutional investment portfolio. That's the revolutionary change, and that will happen through the combination. But I think at the moment there's just some kind of core pain points that are being digitalised that most of the adoption is focused around at the moment.
Okay, good. And William, in terms of the sort of, I mean, Dan obviously highlighted a lot of the trends that were coming up. Which do you see as the sort of most important from your perspective?
I think I'd probably pick, in the long term, the way in which tenants interact with spaces is going to be the thing that most changes the industry. And so that feeds into a few of the different technologies that Dan was talking about. Certainly anything that really touches the future of work, from artificial intelligence, and Dan also mentioned robotics in the same breath as that, and more immediately augmented reality and virtual reality. I think it's probably fair, when you're looking at kind of the fourth industrial revolution, to start thinking about the extent to which, while we have started doing things on computers that we used to do on paper, a real revolution in how people work hasn't happened truly. We haven't really seen that come true and come to fruition. So when people start working in a totally different way, their office environment and then the way in which the entire property industry works will have to adjust in respect to that.
And let's pick that up a little bit, Josh, because obviously part of what you're doing is looking at these spaces, how that works. How do you see that developing, let's say, over the next 1-2 years, because things seem to be moving quite quickly, I think, in that area.
Yeah, there are two ways to look at it. One, actually understanding what we do in the shape of work. So from our internal point of view, the benefit of us looking at things through the lens of neuroscience, it's the ability to understand things mechanistically. We all have tasks to perform, so it's understanding those tasks, understanding us as human beings, and understanding how the space impacts us biologically, that affects us actually in how we perform those things. So you can, for argument's sake, say the higher quality or more sort of human-centric or biologically plausible design is going to have a better level of sort of user-generated productivity. People can probably perform tasks in a matter of 8 hours rather than slaving away late at night because the lighting is incorrect, their anxiety levels are high. So once we understand those variables, we can understand better design, better building management systems. Ultimately, if you look at the shopping centre market, which is on a sort of a turnover basis, the quality of the people performing in those spaces is how those buildings are often collecting their rent. It's only a matter of time until that starts to fit more into the commercial office market. So we probably will see a different investor type who can actually look at that technology, look at the, as you said, the risk return side of things.
Okay, good. And Allan, in terms of that, I mean, if you're then seeking to make a valuation on these things, how do you work out the difference between something which might be a co-working space or a traditional office? What's your sense of how that market is going to develop, and also whether there's practical ways of valuing it in a different way to make it more transparent?
Yes, thank you. Well, first and foremost, I do think that we should stop up for a minute and enjoy that we are living in these times, because in many other industries they have already adapted technology and all that and far ahead of us. But actually in the real estate industry, we're just getting started. So we have this opportunity really to shape the world, shape the technology, how it's being adopted and how it's being enjoyed. And the ones, early adopters here in this room, they of course can excel and they can be ahead of the game. So we sometimes know we're just busy in the rat race and so forth, but actually I think we are so fortunate, we are so lucky that we live in these times and that we can actually learn from the other industries, and then we can adapt to our industry what we think is relevant and what will bring efficiency and other value-added gains to the industry. Actually, in true market value, and now I'm probably going to get on the hit list of some big valuers, but we don't do any valuations. We simply don't do it because we have simply too often seen valuations from two different parties being far apart and actually confusing sellers more than they're helping. And again, that might not be relevant in all markets and so forth. We've seen a lot of markets, even Main Street Copenhagen, you get two valuations and they are 30% apart. So what do you do as a seller? I mean, you're just confused because one is clearly too low, the other one is clearly too high. What we can do at true market value, we can actually find a balance between those two. And in this example, the value was more or less right between those two valuations. So again, we actually don't do valuations, we provide the true market value.
So just to that point, I think that, and I do recognise that, and we obviously hear that. I mean, obviously our kit is in the middle of that valuation arena, and I think what will happen and where the industry is going is it's more frequently traded. A hell of a lot more data points out there that will feed into quantifiable data points that will feed into a valuation calculation. So I'm hoping that those concerns will be kind of removed from the industry because of the vast array of information that's kind of going to come through the sector, that's quantifiable, that's therefore then real time, and the increase in the level of liquidity in the market, providing more transactional evidence. So I think that valuation has gone from annual to quarterly in the digital age. People are now talking about daily valuations, and if you're using the software on that regular basis, feeding in those data points, then hopefully that concern in time will be addressed through technology.
One thing, go ahead.
No, I do think that Phil is right. I mean, they've certainly improved. But again, the thing with valuations is also, we of course do it today, then it might be applied in a transaction 3 or 4 months later. Markets are more dynamic today than they were ages ago. Just Brexit, right? Where are we heading? Where are yields going to be? So therefore, what are prices going to be? Even in London, a very transparent and liquid market.
Yeah.
So again, it's a point in time the valuation might be right, but if markets actually drop, then you have an issue, because then you're maybe too ambitious on the pricing. But if markets go up, then of course you could maybe have getting more.
But with larger data sets, artificial intelligence, machine learning, you come through with far more accurate assumptions that people are arriving at data feed into those valuation models, which are effectively future cash flow projections that I would hope then take some of that risk element off the table.
All right.
And in terms of, I wanted to pick up the point that Dan actually made there about data solutions and big data, and you alluded to that as well, Matt. Now on Dan's slide, all data kind of becomes one in a way. You're obviously doing that in one area of data, picking up a lot of that about research and those kinds of things. Do you see that that's the way that things will head, and that actually this will encourage more transparency in the industry generally?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think there's a lot of companies sitting on a lot of information and a lot of data, a lot of companies collecting a lot of data, and I don't really think the industry has yet worked out what to do with all that data. I think the data is improving sort of day-to-day decisions internally, but I certainly think there is going to be at least one, if not a few, platforms that will work with the companies to help them analyse all of this information and data that they're sitting on. And the reason I think that, and I think it would be a platform, is because if you look across other industries, the ones that rise to the top are generally the ones that sit and become a platform for other services. So, I mean, you look at some of the biggest platforms in the world. I mean, the largest taxi company in the world doesn't own any taxis, Uber. The largest hotel company in the world, Airbnb, doesn't own a single hotel. I mean, you could keep going through. If blockchain becomes a reality, the largest bank in the world could own no money. So, I really think platform will be the key moving forward. There's certainly the data and the information out there. It's just how we go about processing that and delivering it, as Dan's slides said as well.
Interestingly, for the past few years, quite a lot of the largest banks in the world haven't had any money, I think. But I just wanted to pick up on some of those trends, and just to prove that your comments here are important, I noticed we have Anthony here, Anthony Slumbers. In terms of some of these trends, what do you see as the most important, whether that's to do with the sharing economy, co-working space, those kinds of things? And I'm going to pass this to you.
Thank you. We are undergoing a revolution, because I think the real estate business is no longer about real estate. We're moving from a product business to a service business, from a rent collector to a service provider. And in terms of how, it's not how we work, but it's the work we do that is changing so dramatically, and so much as a function of all the technologies that are coming down the road, that we fundamentally do not need offices to work, and we do not need shops to shop. So you have to start looking at what is the industry doing. It has to produce built environments that people want, that they don't need. And so I think there's this fundamental change to a service model, and that is all off the back of changes in technology, largely because the work we do is going to change so much, and that's going to be driven by, you know, the robots and AI will do anything that can be automated will be automated. And the great thing about that is that actually humans aren't very good at what computers are good at, and computers aren't very good at what humans are good at. So we're going to be into this world where we've got sort of exponential technology, but we're going to need to be exponentially human to really leverage it. And so we're going to move from a world where it's not fight the robots, it's human plus computer is going to trump everything. And I think the implications of that are just going to reverberate across the entire built environment.
Thank you, Anthony.
Do we think we're at that point now? To that point, I mean, there still is a massive disconnect, isn't there? So if you think that, and I think one of the statistics is that 40% of the labour market by 2020 is either going to be self-consulting or self-employed. 15% of the office market at the moment is equipped for co-working space. So it really does feel that real estate does need at the moment to catch up with technology. So there's the backdrop for a revolutionary change. But my concern is there's potentially quite a wave of obsolescence about to hit this marketplace.
Oh, there's a huge amount of obsolescence going to hit the market, because there's going to be a huge amount of space that's no longer going to be fit for purpose, because it's just not going to. Our work is going to change to such an extent we're not going to need space like that to do that. So I think we are. People always get the economy wrong. It's very strange. You wander around the city of London, you think, oh, it's all huge buildings. There's actually only 205 companies in the city of London that employ more than 250 people. 40% of the entire UK economy, employees in the entire UK economy work for companies that employ more than 250 people. 48% of all employees in the country work for companies that employ less than 50 people, and there's only 12% between 50 and 250. So everything is a barbell world. If you look at the move to flexible working and all that sort of stuff, you've got the big companies are going to do more and more flexible working. Google did this report last year that said 60% of companies that employ more than companies that employ more than 1,000 people, they reckon 60% are going to be working flexibly in the loosest terms within the next couple of years. So you've got the big companies that are going to do that, and then you've got the small companies. When you're in a space that you only need up to 50 people, there's actually going to be better offerings for you than renting your own office. You're actually much better to put all of the workspace in the hands of a service provider than dealing with that yourself, simply because you're not going to be going to the office five days a week. So I think the revolution's going to happen very, very quickly.
I just want to pick up with you, William, in a way. Obviously, Wired Score, judging the ability of people to be able to meet those criteria. But, I mean, presumably it's kind of a given now, isn't it, that you need to have that connectivity? Or do you think that real estate markets are still a bit of a dinosaur in some ways, and some of this isn't yet being met in order to service the types of occupier or guest that we're going to need in the future?
So I think we probably get two different reactions when we go and see landlords. We get one group who say, like, look, we absolutely understand that connectivity is going to be crucial for tenants in the future, and we've been building buildings with this in mind for years. We've been retrofitting buildings in respect to this for years, and we'd love to find a way to show it off. And then probably about 50% of the landlords that we ever go and talk to say, God, well, we kind of known about this one-ish, sort of, maybe, but we've never really done anything about it, and we was kind of hoping it might go away. And I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is, this isn't going to go away. The internet is definitely not going to get less important. That's the one thing I think probably everyone in here can agree on. And so what they're now doing is working out how they respond to these challenges, how they undertake the kind of right retrofits and general asset management to make sure that they get their buildings to a level that will just enable people to do the kind of base type of work that we need. One of the big changes that's really emphasised the increasing importance of connectivity has been the move to the cloud. Because in previous days we'd be able to just rely on being able to download data quite quickly, but now we need synchronous technologies. We need to be able to upload things just as fast as we can download them, or we're not going to be able to use any of our files. We're not going to be able to save anything. Most of us are switching over to Office 365, let alone those of us on websites listed on Amazon. And these kinds of shifts just change the technology requirements that we have, because where one day copper with ADSL, which lets you go kind of fast, and upload very, very slowly, everyone now needs synchronous technologies. So I think we're seeing a shift in the mindset of all landlords to accept that this is now something that's completely crucial.
Okay, good. And Josh, in terms of that sort of discussion on design of places that Anthony also picked up, how much of that is going to be driven by businesses who maybe don't necessarily know how big they're going to be, and are used to a more sharing kind of economy in general? And I'm thinking about people who've moved through from a different sort of student accommodation into micro-living, into using to have, different to when I was a student, for example, but and are used to having everything available on their phone, and whether all that means that you're in WeWork and having free beer or not, doesn't really matter. But how important is that, and how much does that pick up on that cultural idea of people becoming guests, hospitality, in terms of workspaces?
I'd love to ask the question, who's got a bigger home than their office? And the truth is, our offices are the place we actually enjoy the most. They are the largest and the most diverse places where we have the most interactions. Therefore, it's worthy of understanding how the office fits into our life. And if we stick in the commercial market, at least, we're sitting in a nice big tower, it does have a huge effect, but it's also understanding that workplace within the context of a life. So one of the things we look at, certainly from an urbanisation point of view, are things like anxiety levels that are rising through issues like density. So when you're an occupier, when you're perhaps a landlord, some of the things you're thinking of, well, how is the performance of people going to be using this space? The question is, well, what is the actual performance of these people in general, and how do I mitigate what's bad, and how do I improve where they're coming to be? So when it comes to this idea of, well, do I pick a co-working space? There's a great new one, I can't remember the name, but their focus is all about well-being. So their idea is, well, who are the companies that need to feel calm and concentrated in where they're working? They're not necessarily salespeople, but they might be thinkers. So they're curating their environments to encourage people like that to come to their space. So design will perhaps split the type of spaces being delivered. It will become much more task orientated. So a company that may be predominantly looking at data science will have a very different physical setup, and they'll be looking for all those different characteristics across the city when they're looking to make a decision, not how much is their rent. I mean, you can do the maths that, and in general, a 1% increase in productivity is worth a 10% saving in costs.
Okay, good. I want to pick that up a little bit with you, Dan. In terms of that, the practical use of that, I mean, you mentioned in your slides as well that you'd got changes in terms of retail. Obviously, food and beverage in retail now taking up kind of 30 to 40% of the income streams for quite a lot of the shopping centres. That's the aim, and that's where they're heading. And retail becoming much more about consumer experience than it is just about shopping. Do you think these kinds of trends Josh there mentioned curator. Do you think that idea, which in a way is also partly shopping centres getting the right mix of whether it's food and beverage, entertainment, shops, do you think that's going to come into all of the sectors?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that the industry is going and will go, and I think there's a debate about speed. I kind of agree with all of Anthony's points. I think this is almost an interpretation of speed, really, whether it's evolution or revolution. Buildings are being used differently, and we're going from a product sector to a service sector. So it's going to be increasingly important that buildings perform what they're trying to do. So if you look at offices as the most simplistic, then if you don't perform well in there, then it's not adding as much value as it should. You're spending more and more time there, people are investing huge amounts of money to try and get people to spend more time in offices. And what's also changing with that is it's starting to get much easier to measure. So to use the old expression about what gets measured gets managed, there's so much more data available now to manage performance and manage these things. You can start actually coming up with specific metrics. So I think that any type of property is going to have to perform much, much better for its objectives. So whether that's logistics or retail or office, then all of those are going to have to be better. And if they're not performing well, it's going to be much easier to see that they're not, because there is much more data and metrics on that.
And Phil, just in terms of that part of it, the amount of data that there is available, and presumably there's a lot now coming through. I mean, if you begin to get smart buildings as well, you'll have huge amounts coming through the asset management process, the property management process, because those will actually be real-time monitoring a lot of those things. Who then owns that data? Who can use that data? Is that something that's going to lead to transparency and more efficiency, or is it going to continue where there's going to be a number of people holding different pots of data? You've had the easy ones now, Phil.
On that point, I mean, obviously there is going to be huge volumes of increased volumes of data. A lot more of it is going to be readily available as well. So I mean, you don't have to pay for all the data. You have to pay to bring it together. There will still be experts out there that assist in bringing those data sets together in terms of monetizing it and then selling it on for someone to run their investment strategy model. So I think people will still pay for data, but it'll get refined from multiple different sources. Businesses out there have done a tremendous job over the last 20 years, and I was part of one of those in terms of bringing those data sets together by going out and almost asking people for data, aggregating it together. But I think actually where that data is going to come from in the future is through business processes. So the folks that are out there that are actually developing solutions for the industries, workflow processes for people to operate around, the data that they get from that almost as a byproduct, that's going to be the best in class information that's out there, actionable data that's actually being used in transactions, leasing arrangements, costing, budgeting, development activity. Anyone that's providing technology into those different areas, as a side product, they're going to get that data together. And so I think that's where the industry is going to get a far richer data set ultimately than it does at the moment. I mean, then yes, their businesses will specialise in refining it, kind of grooming it, trying to find patterns within that and sell that on into different investment fund management houses.
Are you coming in on that, Allan?
I think there's a really important angle to look at here. If you think of Apple have something like 15 to 18% market share of the global smartphone business, but they generate 90+% of all the profits. So how are they managing to extract out almost all the profit of the whole industry, even though they have less than a fifth of the market? And the reason is because they marry hardware and software. And I think this is a critical thing for the real estate industry. It needs to start thinking that their assets are not just physical assets. If you think of the physical asset is the hardware, the user experience that everyone who enters that building is provided with is the software. And so in terms of where is the value, I think the long-term value in real estate is actually going to move away from what's the physical value of this building, and it's going to be the user experience of a building for everyone in there is going to be what's behind the brand of a developer or of a building, and the brand is going to equal the value. And so there are huge opportunities, and there is a massive advantage for the large incumbents in the industry at the moment, because they have the scale to create, to suck up enough data to understand how their buildings are working, how the people are using their buildings, and then how to network that across their portfolios. If they do that, that's hugely powerful. That is exactly why WeWork have got a $20 billion valuation. It's nothing to do with, they're not in the real estate business, they're in the user experience business. But if you look behind the scenes of WeWork, they are a great big data company. They might look like a pair of hippies and doing all sort of lovely stuff, but actually they're a big data company. And it's the data that is the real value. How this all affects what the valuation of a property is, I don't know. Say you have two buildings. You have a 100,000 square foot building there, one there. One worked really to an inch of its life in terms of providing a great user experience, as opposed to one next to it that doesn't. one's going to generate an awful lot more money than the other. What is the value if physically they're the same thing?
I think it's interesting when you look at the 4 biggest companies in the world, and if, you know, they're the names that everyone loves to mention. We've already said some of them, but Google have now just submitted their own planning application to develop an area in Toronto. Facebook at work. Amazon now own a series of real estate assets through the acquisition of Whole Foods. Apple as well. We'll wait and see. I'm sure I've forgotten something they're doing. But it is a data question, and when you start to look at how to make money from real estate, the people who know and understand human behavior, human activity, understand human transactions, human production the best, are going to be the ones that can actually look at values created beyond how do I just finance the development of this. They're also the 4 richest companies in the world. Where will real estate developers, investors, advisors, who will they be advising? Is it perhaps the people who can look at the diversification of the income that they can bring in and how they produce it? Or is it still the traditional way of, how do we just understand our own industry? I think there's an awareness that the new investors will be non-traditional real estate investors.
Yeah, and they're looking at, there's ultimately 3 things. You know, we all need to live, work and play, and they're trying to combine those 3 things together. So, I mean, what these, these big technology brands are doing is trying to understand the technology that's going to influence where we live, work and play in the future, and how we want to combine those 3 elements together, which will ultimately lead, I mean, I'm sure, Google HQ to more mixed-use asset classes, where you can hop down to one floor and get your medical check and have your leisure time as well. They're ultimately going to be larger elements of real estate as well. I think also then it leads into maybe another area that at some point you'll have larger structures of real estate. I'm almost certain of that. Larger structures, kind of go with your school books in terms of real estate management, larger specific risk associated with real estate, more securitization potentially of individual assets, more frequently traded real estate environment, changing the whole demographic, as I said at the start, of the whole risk return profile of the marketplace.
Yeah.
Hello, it's Fergus Power from JLL. I work in the valuation side, so I just wanted to touch on the comment that was made about the value differential between the 2 types of concepts we're talking about here. And I think historically, obviously, what's underpinned value is this sort of long-term forecastability of income, and that tends to drive the valuation sector. So with the 15-year lease with fixed RPI uplifts, whatever, that's what investors are looking for to match their risk profile returns. But on the point, sorry, I didn't catch your name, but Anthony, the point you were making about the value differential between a more user experience focused building, which by definition I suppose is going to have more flexibility, therefore less long-term forecastability on income. I mean, that at the moment in the industry is quite difficult to quantify, but what we are seeing is a move to turnover generated incomes, and that is all about effectively the sort of customer experience, especially in the retail sector and shopping centres. We're seeing that a lot, that rents are determined more by turnover than by rate per square foot, etc. And I think the long-term occupancy rates is going to be a factor to sort of bear in mind, that even if you've got a flexible working environment and lease contracts become shorter and shorter, if you've maintained a 10-year occupancy at 95% during that period, a 10-year lease becomes less important. I just thought I would sort of mention that.
No, good. Thank you. And in a way, that's operating more like a hotel. That you're on revenue per night rather than... Okay, interesting. One of the things I want to just pick up with you, Matt, if I can. In general, the real estate market, less transparent than the other main asset classes. More transparent in the States, in terms of data and availability. You look less sure, Dan, I'll come to you in a second. Do you think this more people sharing information is actually going to lead to more transparency that will then help the investment decision?
Good question. So I think, Yes, is a short answer. I think a lot more investments will be made based on data than they will on personal relationships. I'm not saying personal relationships will go out of real estate. I don't think they ever will. But I think there will be a lot more investment decisions made on the data that's available, and we'll move more and more towards what's happened in equities. And the amount of data there and the amount of decisions that are done instantly based on the data that's available to them there. It is different. It is very different. Real estate is slower, much slower than equity. So there's not the need for such instant access to prices. This building isn't changing every second of the day like the stock price might be. But yeah, I think more and more investments will be made based on data, and I think more agents will become more and more like data companies.
Okay, interesting. And Dan, from your point of view, I mean, you mentioned there in the presentation drones. I mean, before it always used to be regarded as well. I mean, I remember when people were saying, "Oh yes, these guys went in. They didn't even bother going to see the asset. They just bought it." And now it turns out that it's not a great asset because they didn't actually go and see it. So, do you think now with drones, with the Google Earth, with all of these kinds of things, that actually you don't need to go and see the asset any longer? You can get all of the information you need from data, or do you actually still need to go and stand on the corner of the street and see whether or not there's a lot of drug users near you? What's the depending on whether that's an appealing thing or not, Dan. But
So if I were buying a building, I would want to know quite a lot about that building, and I think that you can do that in a number of different ways, and it's probably wise to do it in a mixture. So go and visit it, or get someone else to go and visit it, or get some expert's opinion, or use some data, or use some technology. So the truth is, it's probably going to be a mixture of all that. Undoubtedly, technology will replace some of the human going to visit sites and do stuff. What it's probably more likely to do is just increase the amount of insight that we have. So it doesn't replace things specifically, it means that we make better decisions. So the answer is that all forms of technology, I think, will just allow us to make better insights. Of course, that will mean that sometimes we can take less risk without visiting a site. Personally, if I was buying a big building, I'd want someone to visit it, but I would do a lot of the early stages with technology.
So in essence, this makes the process more efficient and quicker, really, in a way that you're cutting out some of the points that you might need to you may need to only be able to do one site visit as a final decision about it, rather than potentially more than that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we've already seen that in residential. So if you look at the residential sector at the moment, most people, when they buy a house, will go on to Rightmove. They'll go and have a look at Zoopla, Rightmove, whatever it might be, and they'll do an awful lot of looking at the area and where they want to go before they go and visit a property. So actually, whilst housing transactions are going up, you've still got estate agents, you've still got surveyors who are going around. People tend to look at many, many more properties before they go, and they filter down the quality. So it's already happening in residential.
And how much of the valuation do you think from that is based on estate agents' valuers, and how much of it is just to look at, okay, so this is what everything has been sold for recently in your street, therefore the average price is X? That's for you. And is there going to be a competition in that sense between, let's call it, mining that kind of data without an intelligence over the top of it? How important is the intelligence over the top, I guess, is what I'm trying to work out.
So I think if you look at residential as an example, because that's further ahead using technology, then the value of a property is what someone will pay for it, effectively. And it goes back to what Josh was saying, and others as well. It does impact whether you've got good broadband. Rightmove have got that on. It does impact whether you're in a good school catchment area. It does impact what you think of the design of the house. So all of this comes into it, and effectively what someone pays is what it's worth. Now, from a residential point of view, because there is a lot of high transaction turnover, you can start inferring backwards to say, actually, it's probably worth this because similar properties in the area are worth that. So from a residential point of view, the overlaying and analytics is very important. And I don't see commercial being that different, it's much more complicated. You've also got a much less owner-occupier, so it's much lower turnover of properties. So an awful lot of problems of doing the same thing, but the basic principles are pretty much the same. So the value is the value of the property is how much someone wants to work in it. And I think someone said earlier, one of the big shifts that we've seen is recognising, measuring and understanding the whole performance of the people inside there and caring about that, rather than the product of the building.
Okay, good. I've got a question here that, having seen Gartner's hype cycle, I wanted to ask a question which is, don't believe the hype, partly because it's very difficult to get a Public Enemy song title into one of these sessions, so I'm delighted to have achieved that. But in terms of, you've often got with these evolutions or revolutions, you've got a number of different things which we've got at the moment, which are all going to potentially have a huge impact, but some of them ultimately will probably die away. Are there things which, and this is open to everybody, are there things which will definitely happen, are already a long way through that cycle, and some that you're less certain of will have a genuine concrete, either concrete use or impact on the market?
I'll dive into this one. I think the first thing we need to think about with the hype cycle is the fact that Dan showed us a quote from 1966. We've this kind of predictions about change have been around a long time, and so we all need to take everything with a tiny pinch of salt. Having said that, I think many of us in this room are strong believers that the change is happening right now. But if you talk to an awful lot of property companies, certainly within the general concept of Proptech, there's a lot of Proptech fatigue. People are slightly getting a little bit bored of having to deal with this as an issue. And so many property companies have said, right, well, we're going to pick one or two or maybe three different things, and then we're going to go down those avenues, but that's it. We're kind of shut up shop, because we don't want to try to have to deal with all of this. We want to see how the market evolves and how other people adopt different things before we dive in. I think one that I will probably point to, just because I spend a lot of that time with them in the general Proptech space, so I think is going to be adopted very, very quickly, is different workflow management tools. One of the comments I'm quite fond of is whenever one colleague sends an Excel sheet to another, the software as a service butterfly flaps its wings, because we shouldn't be using Excel for stuff that it's currently being used for. It's completely baffling. And as someone like me who came into the industry about 2 years ago, that genuinely loads of really complex transactions are happening with people just sending different tracking tools in Excel to each other, which is why Vitesse has become one of the best capitalized Proptech companies in the world, and they've started to make decent footholds, just because that's an obvious shift. So I think we'll see some of the really obvious early ones get picked up now and in the next couple of years, and I think it's actually going to be a little slower to adopt the others, because I think that much of the property sector is tired of trying to have to deal with all these different voices saying all these different things need to change right now.
Yep. And one which is quite controversial, but I think blockchain might be a bit hyped, at least in the industrialized world, because well, and again, it could certainly be me making a mistake here, but I tried really to study it down.
I'm agreeing with you.
Oh, you are? Okay. Well, I mean, the thing is, if I understand it right, blockchain is, for example, again, in the UK and in Northern Europe and so forth, I mean, I trust money transfer. I mean, I trust the banks. I mean, the little that's you can trust. But I do trust that money transfers from the right party. So I don't need blockchain to help me with that. Title transfers in most civilized countries is again reliable. So I don't see it there. And data availability, and again, that's not for every country, but in many countries there's a lot of public data that I trust. So I don't have the trust issue. Of course, dealing in maybe in Africa or South America, yes, maybe so. But in countries that has a good regulated system, I don't see blockchain being these types.
Okay, good. Matt, I wanted to pick something up with you. Just in terms of the sharing of data, obviously your platform in a way relies on that, and I just wanted to pick up the kind of point that Anthony made in a way, which was about cultural shifts, it seems to me also that potentially there needs to be a cultural shift within the industry. How difficult is it to get people who've got lots of pieces of information, to share them with you so that you can share them? And do you think that that in terms of the higher echelons of the industry, that actually people aren't taking the Proptech side seriously or don't really want to engage in it?
Yeah, I think it's changing. I mean, it took us 2.5 years to get 10 companies, and it's taken us another year to get 360. So it's certainly changing. And I think the way it's actually changing now is where there's been so many like data scraping companies and things like that, is I think companies are more happy to share their information and share their data and share their research as long as they're credited with it. You know, the JLLs of the world, the Savills, the Colliers, the Cushman, these guys release fantastic research reports on what's happening within the market, and they do that for marketing purposes to show off their knowledge of what's happening within these sectors. And I think, you know, I won't name them, but there are some companies, CoStar of the world, that have built a lot of resentment from how they've gone about using data within the industry. So the shift is already starting to happen, and that has attracted a lot of money to the industry. That's attracted a lot of startups. Some are going to make it. I think we're going to see a large drop off. There'll be more adoption, but there's going to be a large number of companies that won't make it. So yeah.
I think just on that point, and it goes back to the point of workflow management tools, which I made before. I think that's it. It's taking the pain point out of the industry and actually bringing that data together. So if you, through a workflow management tool mentioned before, you can bring that data together without any kind of pain point from the proprietor of that information set. That's what's going to be a big transformation. Because at the moment, having to scrape through all different sources to bring that data together for someone else to aggregate. If you can, through a business process, bring that data together, I think that's a big changing point, I think, in the industry. I think the other thing, just maybe to your earlier question in terms of the big changes coming down the line, there's an IBM statistic about 90% of the data created in the last 2 years. I mean, that's quite a staggering statistic when you think of artificial intelligence and machine learning and what that can do for this industry. Because I don't think we've really scratched the surface, really, in terms of managing the volume of data that we'll hopefully have access to in the future.
Yeah, I think there's also a second point to it, is actually also we need the data on what people are actually interested in out of the data. So it's all very well collecting a massive data and massive information, but we need to start learning what people actually care about within that data set.
It's mostly their faces if you take the amount of Instagram pictures around.
So yeah, I think that'll be a big part of it as well. And I think where something what Infabode wants to do, and I'm sure lots of other platforms want to do, is actually customise what they're delivering. So if you personally interested in lease rates or whatever it might be, to deliver that data out of a massive data set.
And do we get into issues around data privacy, around what could happen if data is not secure? I mean, data privacy, we mentioned people taking pictures of their faces, and obviously there's technology now to work out when you enter a shopping centre whether you're happy or not, and a lot of those kind of sensors on buildings going forward, registering whether you're well or not, whether you're, they'll be telling me I've eaten too much or whatever it might be, shouldn't have had that last glass of wine as I'm walking along probably. But how much of that privacy aspect do you think is going to start into the availability of this data? Because everyone at the moment thinks it's fantastic. But do you think there'll be a reversal of that? Or do you think this is just a path we're set on, increasing data, more information about everything?
If I jump to that one. Sadly, there is a lot of concerns over privacy. We heard at one Estates Gazette, thought they did last Friday, there was one massive fund who just would not release their data into a cloud because of the concerns that they had, just major privacy. And I think there is a concern over privacy. I think when it comes to facial recognition, I really have a question, is that the problem we're trying to solve? I can't see it as a problem. I don't see there's a benefit. I really question why Apple have done it. I think it's quite a cheap gimmick. So when we use it for perhaps the built environment, it's not necessary. It's a gimmick. It's a fad. It moves on. How people can interpret your facial data is a scary thing, because pooling the wrong data sets or the wrong metrics will lead to very inferior results. So I think many people saw the article that came out last week, or I think the week before, a series of researchers at Stanford did a whole series of facial recognition, and one of the apparently programs they wanted to determine was whether they could detect whether someone was homosexual or not. That is a completely sort of immoral and unethical, but also ungenuine, because it doesn't count for anyone's, perhaps if they're bi-curious, whether they're transgender, any other form of the spectrum of sexuality. So the question of are you this or are you that through a function of just trying to observe one metric of facial structure is completely immoral and wrong. And that is when the person who's trying to perhaps look at those services and employing them really needs to start questioning, how am I interpreting this data and employing it? I think that is the massive backlash. To judge whether someone's happy from the facial expression, having the benefit of working with a lot of scientists in this field, that is a very, very hard thing to do. There is a lot of BS in the world of, oh, we can apply and understand the science behind you. This comes from someone who went to art school, is now in a science-based industry in real estate, so you can see I'm trying to balance a lot of BS myself. There is still a lot to go before we really get into that sector that becomes sensible, because until then people will hold back their data. I think a big question is people should be asking more and more from these companies, what problems are you solving rather than what gimmicks are you giving me?
So if I can pick up on that, I think normatively I absolutely agree with you. People should be asking that, and companies should be really reticent to put their data forward. But if you actually look at an individual level, it is amazing at the amount of data people are willing to give away personally. The kind of way in which they are very comfortable with Google and Facebook tracking their activity all over the internet. And people are agreeing to these things because it's giving them a huge amount of convenience. Now, I hate that. I'm a classical million liberal, I think that's an awful idea. But it so happens that I'm in a tiny minority of people, because people seem to be willing to make enormous sacrifices of personal privileged information for convenience. And unless that trend reverses, I think we're going to go further and further down the line that people will just accept it. Maybe there will be some enormous backlash because someone goes too far, and we say, line in sand, no, it turns out we actually don't want to be judged on our sexuality by our face as we walk into office one day, but we haven't seen that yet, and the majority of the world isn't moving in that direction.
So can I just say, so I agree with that. I just think the problem at the moment is most people aren't thinking about it. So actually, so personally, I've got an Android phone. I've kind of taken the decision that I give Google most of my data, so they know about it and they get it, and I get some great services from it. I've given up a lot of security. And actually, whatever the answer is, it almost doesn't matter, as long as you think about it and you understand what you're doing. The concern is when people think, we're not giving up any data at all, yet Google know everything about you. For me, that's the bigger issue, is where people are giving away huge amounts of data. And as for the real estate industry, we're just starting to catch up with how do we collect all this data from Internet of Things. It's really exciting, it's going to really help things. There is a massive potential risk, to go back to your earlier question about how we allow other people to use that. There's not a lot of data that couldn't be used for good purposes. Whether it should or shouldn't is a different matter. But if you collect data, you use it for good purposes, and then other people can use it for less good purposes, that's a massive issue. So I think just having the discussion and being aware of it is vital.
Blindly accepting the data as being truth is the big concern. This isn't necessarily real estate, but if you type CEO into Google, it'll take you a lot of pages until you find a person of colour or a lady. And that can be damaging. And you trust Google as being this information resource. And the question is that the correct image that is being portrayed? And if someone is learning from that, are they picking up that heuristic as they're going forward? Now, that's the question. It's how we interpret and how we have these warning signs, perhaps, of, hey, this is one hypothesis of how we're looking at this data. If you want to see different metrics, let's change that. And so as much about being a data provider is also giving agency to the users to be able to change that data so they can understand better and then have a better relationship with that data. I think that's one of the things that's missing in Proptech as a whole, is actually how to educate and inform financial managers, people who are very skilled, but not necessarily data programmers, or even understanding the psychological aspect of people. And so there is a training, almost like a retraining element. I think you mentioned before about landlords who aren't familiar, really understanding the internet. I mean, I know when I look at any of my parents use their phone, it's like, oh, they're scared of it. And that's not necessarily their vision, they're wearing glasses, they're just still scared of it. That there is a training element to understand the truth behind certain data sets.
Because actually all of this kind of comes back to thinking about what is the value proposition that you are offering your customer, and going back to the idea of brand. This whole thing about brand is going to be partly what value proposition are you offering your customer, what surrender of their privacy are you asking for in order for you to provide this exceptional user experience, and part of it will be concocting this whole brand that gives your customer a good enough user experience with a fair and reasonable and transparent trade-off with privacy, and that's all going to be part and parcel of the whole thing.
Yeah, my name's Jitin. I'm a residential developer, so I completely buy into all space as a service, and I think that's maybe it's more applicable to the commercial sector. You can install things like sensors and monitor how people use the space, and then people like CENTRIC Labs are doing work to help property managers understand that. But on the residential side, how can you do that? And because people don't want to, because of privacy issues, you can't really put sensors and monitors in there so much. You can try and understand how they better use it, but is this shift towards space as a service more limited within residential because of those privacy issues?
Well, you can put Amazon Echo in there. People will talk to their, voice is going to become a much more common interface to computers, and Amazon Echo is just starting, what's the time? Turn the heating on, turn the television on, give me Radio 4, do this, do that. I think there's going to be a lot coming into residential, I think, which is largely going to be sensor-based and voice activated. Which is one of the interesting things where potentially the software industry might come into real estate, because a lot of this stuff hasn't worked to date because you've got so many different standards. But you can imagine maybe, what would an Apple flat be like? Completely kitted out, or Google apartment, or something like that. I think there will be a lot of utility, but it has to be built in. You've got to remove all the friction from using it, and that's partly why voice is so nice.
If I can add, it is a workplace tool. It's called Humanize with a Y at the end of that. What they do is everyone has their sort of workplace dongle that's around. I think you've seen it before. I'm sure some people may have. And it understands who is talking to who in a space. So it understands vocal interactions, but it anonymizes. So that the actual program anonymizes the content that is being spoken and just understands the frequency and also the tonality. And that is a way, perhaps, when you start to anonymize the data and that someone employing that type of service is aware that it's becoming, and they're selling the fact that it's anonymized, that someone can look at they're relinquishing that kind of concerned privacy element into the home. And that's the point where you can understand, perhaps from a social point of view, are there elements of domestic abuse occurring that people aren't aware of? And people like Nesta are very good at looking at different data sets to understand and uncover some of these issues. So it is about the responsibility of companies to be very transparent in the fact that they can anonymize data, and that they are. If they don't, we're still going to get to the bound moment when people should be like, no, I don't want to give away my data. It is the software company's responsibility and the consumers to demand it as well.
I think first and foremost, the valuation is, based on some assumptions. The assumptions that the human subjective input, and of course, that can vary, so to say. So what we do in this situation is that we apply a digital auction software to establish that price. So we have gone through a process where we have qualified investors. So if there are 2 or 3 investors all wanting the same property, and again, there's so much capital wanting to get into real estate, and then we simply put it on auction, but only amongst these pre-qualified investors approved by the selling party, and then they bid the price until they have found the true market value, until they have found what is the market at that current time. So if the valuation is 6 months old, and things have changed, interest rates, politics, whatever, then on that day they find the market price. So what a buyer is willing to pay. And the beauty really is, it can only be 2 outcomes. Once you have qualified, it can only be 2 outcomes. So as an investor, you're in control. So either you win the property at a price that you're happy to pay, willing to pay, or you lose because you found out the price is too much, it's too rich, and that somebody else in the industry is overpaying. But typically it's maybe a matter of 50,000 or less the difference. So again, you don't have this winner's curse. You know you haven't overpaid by much, you've just overpaid by a fraction, and therefore you actually also are as an investor at ease that you paid the right price. Did that explain?
Yeah, no, I was thinking it would be more about sort of data inputs into how areas changing, what dynamics.
We go through all that structured process and we include as much data as is available and as the seller can gather. Of course, because we want to take out risk. So we want to, again, make it not into a commodity, but at least make sure that there are not too many questions, too many open ends, because then we know pricing will be questionable or be problematic. So yes, information is a big part of it, but it can certainly also be better.
And if it is traded on a more frequent basis, which I think we'll all, if with a show of hands, I think everyone would agree to that, and then it's going to go back to my point at the start, then what happens to the risk-return demographic of the asset, because arguably it starts to potentially perform more like an equity, the comment there about shorter lease profiles, potentially less like a bond. Where does it then sit in terms of your kind of risk-return trade-off as a multi-asset allocator? And I think that's understanding all of that requires all this information that needs to come to the surface, or else real estate will ultimately lose pace with other asset classes in terms of that kind of asset allocation decision.
Okay, good. I'm aware of time. So there's one question over here. Are there any more? And then I'll try and deal with them all in one go. No? Okay, great. One there. Okay.
Hi, my name is Joachim. Allan, you made mention of Africa in one of your comments.
Yes.
I really want to understand, with regards to Africa, what opportunities are there for Proptech? Do we have enough market data for Africa? How can international investors embrace the opportunities in Africa?
Thank you. Very good question. And I spent 2 years in Africa, and I really love the continent. I think there's so much opportunity, and it really has a great future ahead of it. I do think that we will see what we saw in the telecommunications industry, where Africa will jump one step of evolution. Simply, going not for a fixed line, but go straight to mobile phone technology. And I hope and I think that the real estate industry has the same opportunity to simply, cut that middle age kind of thing and jump straight to Proptech in many aspects. Because I do think that you have a lot of challenges that technology can help solve. So technology is good for Africa.
Okay, good.
Just very quickly, with regard to data providers and data service providers, it seems to me at the moment there's an awful lot of products out there, but there's not that many solutions that actually add value to the bottom line. This is the status today, perhaps, or my perception of the status today. But how far do you think, in terms of getting to where we need to be, does that need to come from these data companies or data providers improving their user experience, and it might be allowing users to change the variables and explore more by themselves, as opposed to sending a query and then coming back with a static page of answers? Or how much of it is the existing property industry upskilling themselves and actually hiring in data scientists themselves from that? It seems obviously the answer is both to a certain extent, but where is that going to play out? Does every property company need to become a data company, or is it going to, that balance going to be there?
Yes.
So just to pick up on that, so to duck the question, the answer is yes to both. I don't think every property company needs to employ huge amounts of data scientists, although that might be a good thing. Where the property sector needs to get better is having a discussion about whether it shares data or not. So there's a really big issue about people in the same sentence can contradict themselves about our USP is data, we should open all data up because it's not really very valuable. We don't want to pay for it, but it should be open and free. And that's contradicting yourself 4 or 5 times in the same sentence. And we need to have a clear, and there's no necessarily a single answer to that, but we have to, as companies and as a sector, the property sector, think about that. The other thing about the other side of it is the technology companies. I think it's been said a few times. Ultimately, why would you bother using any of this technology if it doesn't provide some form of value at some point? So I think it's incumbent on both sides to be a bit more open and engaging and thinking about data, but also from a technology point of view, make sure that you are offering value in some shape or form. Otherwise, what's the point of having it?
Okay, good. Yeah, Allan, go ahead.
And one question, and again, this is not to open a big debate because I don't think time will allow, but again, actually what I wanted is, when regulations are going to hit real estate. I mean, if we look at the magnitude of the industry and how important it is for society and for business and so forth, and then if we look at, for example, banking, which was my background, see how heavily that is regulated, almost like it's killing it. But in the real estate industry has so far, gone under that radar. When will politicians and regulators and tax authorities start demanding data?
Yeah, I think already though that data protection laws, especially the ones that are coming in soon, are going to have a big impact. I mean, I can't take credit for this or blame if it's wrong, but someone told me yesterday that Wetherspoons deleted all 150,000 contact details they had sitting in their database because it wouldn't comply with the new laws that are coming in next year, so they're going to start from scratch now. So I think already that will come in, but what will happen, and like Facebook always pushed the limits on it and let regulation caught up, and the time regulation caught up, it was acceptable. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think you're right. I think certainly more and more, especially when people realise actually what's happening with this data. I think there was a point earlier. I don't think actually people realise how much data is being collected on. There's a link on Google and it can show you where on the globe and what buildings you've been in, and you go to a website and you see those lovely little Facebook share buttons on the page. Well, Facebook's just tracked that you visited that website. So there's a massive amount of data out there people don't realise.
You can do it on your phone, for those that don't know. Go into location services, it'll even tell you where your home is, and you never plugged it in.
So there's a massive amount of data people don't realise, and yeah, I do think regulation will have an impact. Yeah.
That's very useful to know if I ever get lost. Yeah. That's good. Good. I've got one last question, which is just to try and nail down what you think the most influential trend out of these will be, and over the next 10 years. So something that you think will really stick. And the other second part is, so that's what you think the most influential trend will be, and also if it is a revolution, normally somebody faces the guillotine. So who will that be, and who will be the leaders of the brave new world? Dan, starting with you.
Okay, thanks. So I think the biggest impact is going to be the ecosystem, so I wouldn't choose any one particular thing. I think data is a huge topic that could fill up a month's conference, but I think the industry needs a discussion about property, data, how we share it, and what we want to do with it. Who's going to face the guillotine? So I'm pretty optimistic about things. I think that the property developers of the future, the property advisors, the valuers, the people who are best placed to do that is the people who are doing it now. What I do think is going to happen is not necessarily any particular area, but the people who bury their head in the sand and don't start embracing technology. So my view would be that it's not that there's going to be any one sector, it's going to be more a type of people, which comes back to the culture stuff earlier. So I think technology is going to have an impact in some shape or form, and we need to embrace that, in which case the traditional property sector is in a pretty good place to capitalise that and improve everything going forward.
Okay, good. Matt?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. I think those that face the shop will be the ones that don't embrace technology. Those that do embrace it, their jobs they'll just change. I don't think necessarily be replaced. But yeah, I genuinely agree with what's that.
Richard, I think that transparency is going to have a larger role, and it's going to be a trend because because of the transparency necessarily, but because the efficiency it brings. Because I do think that most of us, we can't work much harder, but we have to work smarter, and therefore the efficiency we all need. And we all, I think, remember at least once more than 40 years old when we got our first BlackBerry, right? I mean, that step change in effectiveness you could just witness in your own hands. And I think that's going to be important. And who's going to be in trouble? I think it's going to be harder to get away with not adding any value. So if you're a service provider and you can't add any value, and that could be, adding value could be in terms of technology or in terms of know-how. so consultancy, But if you can add value, you will have a future, and you will have a bright future. But if you can't add any value, it will be transparent, and you will be out of your job.
Okay.
Very quickly, I think the technology which is got to be the first one that we really think about is artificial intelligence and the move to artificial general intelligence. The work of Google's DeepMind team is extraordinary. I was having a friend who worked there 2 days ago, and if we actually do move at the pace that they think that we will move, their AGI, we're going to be in just a whole new world, and so everything will really become secondary to that. I'm going to sort of strike a note of gloom on the point about revolution, which is coming back and being pedantic, if Josh won't mind me. The four biggest companies in the world, were the ones that he mentioned, are the four biggest publicly traded companies in the world. The biggest company in the world is Saudi Aramco. They are sitting on an enormous oil reserve, and they have been slowly producing oil from there for in one form or another 100 and so years. People manage to sit on very large assets and be in fortunate positions, which means that they don't really need to change, and they can still stay enormous. And if you look in the property sector, if you actually happen to own a big chunk of the middle of London or Hong Kong or New York, you actually, it turns out, don't need to evolve that much, and you're still fine. And I think the great fear is that there are some incumbents who maybe won't change, and they will provide a worse service for their potential tenants and a worse service for people who want to interact with them in the industry, but they will still bumble on by because of what they had for long and old historical reasons.
Some hope for me, possibly, then. That's good. Josh?
I think the technology that excites me most and the biggest impact is augmented reality. I think stepping outside of the just standard office market, you see the work that Blip are doing in education. I think that is one of the most exciting things I've seen generally in society. I think it's important to remember that we look at real estate as a result of our society in general and how it can facilitate that. So I think augmented reality, when it starts to fit in, I think that might be as much the opportunity for the gentleman asked a question about Africa. Making those leaps, if you can't have everyone connected physically, how can you do that better digitally? I think virtual reality, if anyone's put a headset on for more than 3 minutes, the technology is still a long way away. It's still like 3D printing. We all loved that. Someone bought one, then it went bust. It's still an industry that's going to make its way to go. I think AR is really, really interesting point. What do I feel, in my humble opinion, of who's in trouble? Those who really just look at real estate as a bond return basis. It's an active management tool. If you want your 25-year lease, go find a restaurant somewhere in a secondary city and hope that TGI Fridays last for another 25 years.
Phil?
Right.
Big fan of TGI Fridays?
I agree with the other five, but I think, so who faces the problem points out there. We did a survey actually about a year ago, and it said that kind of, I think of it was interviewing people, kind of investment fund management houses, C-level executives. They said 40% of those organisations didn't have a data and a technology strategy. That's an alarming statistic, I think, that's out there. The opportunity set, and actually slightly different to William, I think real estate is actually, one of the problems with real estate, it's a collection of very, very small businesses, and that's partly one of the problems that we face. I mean, it's hugely inefficient because there are a multitude of small businesses. Someone mentioned earlier, and someone else, it's going to require platforms to bring together all these good ideas that are coming through the marketplace. Businesses large businesses most probably vet 3 or 4 pieces of tech a year max. So they do the ones that are maybe going to really succeed are going to be those platform providers that link this ecosystem together.
Okay, good. Thank you.